Bam. Hello, how are you doing? And welcome to another episode of the Dr. Will Show, where I interview educators and entrepreneurs on leveling up. Each episode, I zoom in someone and we have a conversation on what it means to live your best life. As you know, I often bring on authors to talk about their books. And today's guest is Catlin Tucker, right? You heard what I said, people. We have royalty in the house. She will be talking about her brand new book, Power Up Blended Learning, which is awesome and it fits nicely. If you've been following her series of books on blended learning, this fits right nicely behind everything. So go out and buy them all if you don't have them already. And today we're going to be talking about her book and how professional learning should look like when you are trying to bring blended learning into your schools. So for those who will be watching on YouTube or on SoundCloud or iTunes, Catlin, will you please introduce yourself?
I am an educator, so I have been in the classroom for 16 years, and a few years ago I went part-time, so I was teaching English language arts actually in a pilot program where I co-taught with a science teacher and history teacher, very dynamic kind of new pilot program, and then went half-time in my teaching role so I could do blended learning coaching. So not actually in my district, but primarily in the district north of us, and then in districts around my district in Northern California. And it's been an interesting juggle having a foot in the classroom and then also coaching and having the opportunity to support teachers one-on-one as they're making this shift. And in addition to that, I travel and train teachers all over, and I speak at conferences and events and write books. So I keep myself busy.
Yes, she's out there doing it, people. So you are no stranger to blended learning. In fact, you've written a few books. You have a blog on the subject. So what was the pain point behind writing Power Up Blended Learning?
So my previous books have been primarily for a teacher audience. Blended Learning in Action, my last book, was very much teacher-facing and leader-facing, and more focused on how do you make blended learning a reality? Like, what does it look like in action? But this book, the audience is different. So the audience for this book is really school leadership and coaches. And there's a lot of different titles that coaches wear. But for me in the book, I'm really focusing on kind of those instructional coaches. And if their goal is to support the shift from traditional teaching to blended learning, then I really call them the blended learning coach, because they have to have some pretty specific qualities to be successful in that role. And for me, because I have trained teachers all over the world, that's a wonderful opportunity to sit down and spend a day or a couple days with teachers. But I don't get to see how those efforts, how that time we spend together translates into implementation. And my fear is that I probably only move the needle in those whole group trainings with a very small percentage of attendees who are probably come in motivated and excited, and then they leave and they're going to stumble and they're going to fall, but they might keep pushing. For the rest of them, I think it's inspiring probably hearing me speak and working with me for a day or a couple of days, but I worry they don't implement. They don't have the support to bridge from the moments we spend together to the reality in the classroom. And so I just decided, I need to think about, if I was designing a school and I was thinking about really building a professional learning infrastructure, what would that look like? And the book is very much an ideal vision, and schools will kind of take parts of it and pieces of it, but I wanted to lay out what I truly think needs to happen if we're serious about having teachers change their practice, and especially with technology, because it's not just a new teaching strategy, it's new teaching strategies, new teaching models, and technology, and that's a lot. It really, because technology is changing so quickly, it requires constant growth and experimentation and failure and learning.
Yes. So let's begin by talking about sort of traditional education and how it still boggles my mind that we're in the 21st century, and not just 2001, but 2018. And people still hold the same beliefs of what good teaching, of what good instruction looks like today as they did 50 years ago. And many of the education programs across the nation are still preparing their students to teach in a classroom that no longer exists for most schools in America. What does the shift to blended learning mean for both the teacher and student? And why is it important for schools to evolve from the sit and get lecture style to a learning environment that intentionally leverages the power of the internet?
That is such a complicated question. And I think sometimes people lose sight of the fact, or lose sight of the, like, why. Why did we ever use the traditional sit and get? Okay, well, think way back to single room schoolhouses and having one book, 5 books, right? You had, before the internet, before we could just jump on a device and do a Google search, you had one person in the room who had the knowledge. They had the information. They had that subject area expertise. And so, of course, they had to stand and do some talking and explaining because they're the source of the information. Now, information is everywhere. Kids have access to more information than ever before. And unfortunately, the experience in the classroom, in a lot of classrooms, not all classrooms, but in a lot of classrooms, is not evolving to teach the skills that kids need to find the information they're looking for. Most kids don't even know how to do an effective Google search, right? So they're not learning how to search smart. They're not learning how do I assess the credibility of this thing I found online? Because just because it's online doesn't make it true. Mm-hmm. And then how do I take what I'm learning in these different places online and synthesize it to create things that matter? And what's interesting is a lot of teachers fear, well, if I'm not the only person who is the keeper of the information, and then all of a sudden the computer can do that, well, my job is eliminated. Absolutely not. Our jobs are more important than ever. And I think that if approached from a particular way, we could see technology is freeing us to do the parts of our job that most of us really enjoy. So instead of standing and being a fountain of knowledge and spewing everything you know all over people, now all of a sudden we're teaching very explicit skills. We can become coaches in the classroom where we sit next to students and we help them develop as individual learners. We can architect these learning experiences where we create the design, but they bring the meaning, they do the actual building. I mean, it's just so interesting. I think there's so much fear around technology and what this means for our profession. But I think technology really demands that teachers become that coach. They become those architects, that their jobs are almost even more nuanced and valuable now.
And I want to throw this out there to you because in the book you do mention mindsets. Well, when you have teachers who they themselves believe. Now, we know that most of administrators are dinosaurs, but when you have teachers themselves who they're in the classroom every day, administrators aren't, but they themselves believe my role as a teacher is to do this, give you a worksheet, and that's my job. I was trained that way. I believe it to be true. And especially if you have those teachers that at the end of the year, they can tell you, have you seen my test scores? Okay, I'm killing it. I don't want to hear about this technology, this blended learning, because I'm doing what I need to be doing. How do you tackle that mindset of teachers who really, quite honestly, don't see the need for it at all?
I mean, there are definitely those teachers out there. It's interesting. I encounter those teachers when I do kind of like a whole group mandatory training. So a school or a district brings me in and they're like, you're going to spend the day with Catlin. And I get the whole spectrum. I get the really excited teachers who are like, yes, I see this. This is like powerful. I'm excited. You have the middle of the road, where you have a whole little kind of spectrum of teachers who are, they're excited, but they're hesitant. They're excited, but they're scared. They're excited, but they're already overwhelmed, and I've been in all of those places. So I totally get all the iterations of that, like on the fence teacher. Mm-hmm. And then you have the teachers who enter training, their hands crossed. They don't want to hear it. Those aren't the teachers I want to target. I think on some level, me telling them, hey, this is why I think this is valuable. These are the changes I've seen in my classroom or in the classrooms where I coach teachers. I think those teachers on a campus who are kind of like, you know what, I'm not interested in this conversation. What I'm doing works. And, I could argue with them about the bar that they're setting for what works, just getting scores on an exam. I've always had issues with standardized exams. Don't think standardized exams are going to really be a predictor of who's going to be successful in this very rapidly changing world that we live in. But that's, I don't even think having that debate with that teacher is really where I want to invest my time. I would much rather invest my time with the teachers who are excited or the teachers who are hesitant but open on some level, even if it's just a little open, because on a school campus, if you can start to turn the teachers, like get the ones who are excited going, turn the ones who are like a little hesitant and get them experimenting, there becomes this almost like critical mass of movement that happens where all of a sudden you have a lot of teachers trying things and you have students starting to talk about what's happening in this classroom versus this classroom. And it puts pressure on those teachers who are like, I don't want to waste my time with this. I don't want to invest my energy here. And that's where I've seen movement happen when it comes to the really reluctant folks on a campus, is once there starts to be this kind of critical mass of movement. So, I'm a realist and I'm not going to dump my time and energy into trying to convince somebody of something. I think it's much more powerful if they start hearing from their colleagues, hey, I tried this and this is what happened, That's a much more authentic kind of way to grab those people. But it's hard. I get frustrated because I'm like, man, I've been where I've never been totally closed, but I've felt all the frustrations that teachers feel. Not enough technology, not enough support, no, professional development and training geared towards these things. Like students who really like their passive role as receivers, and I get it, but our jobs have to change. Everything around us is changing. And so to pretend that the classroom where we're equipping students for life, like that doesn't have to change, that's just blinders happening.
So how do you get teachers on board? Because, when you talk about, I come in, I do this one timer, I roll out, that's different from in your book when you talk about, okay, professional development should be ongoing. So that means you're going to be seeing that teacher on a regular basis. So as much as you may want to say, I'm not going to deal with Ms. Johnson because Ms. Johnson don't want to be bothered with, you're seeing Ms. Johnson on a weekly or bi-weekly basis.
Right.
So how do you get teachers on board with the shift to blended learning?
So in my role the book lays out kind of like a 3-part path. So the first part is what I call the spark. And that's really where most of the learning kind of ends on a campus, which is, it's the beginning of the year. We're all coming together for a day of learning or 2 days of learning. And you could bring in someone like me who is an expert on some topic. And we explain the why, like, why is this valuable? And we start equipping teachers with the how, right? Here's how you get some of this done. But, because it's a short period of time, on some level, there's only so much depth you can cover in a spark in that whole group training. And often that spark gets people excited, but if there's nothing else, then the spark fizzles. And so from there, I argue, yes, have the spark, but let's not treat professional learning like an event, because it should very much be a process. And so from there, teachers should have access to a coach who can support them as they take what they learned in the spark and they try to implement it. And that's where the blended learning coaching becomes so valuable. And in my own work as a coach, I follow a very specific kind of coaching cycle that has worked really well with the teachers I work with. So from kind of initial conversation and goal setting, into co-lesson planning, and then eventually real-time coaching and reflection. So there's like 6 parts of the cycle that I use with teachers. And then from coaching, kind of like a gradual release of kind of the responsibility of learning, continual learning, into professional learning communities, like the PLC structure. Now, the interesting piece is that as a coach, I can only work with a handful of teachers at a time to do this intensive coaching. And sometimes I talk with other coaches and they say, Catlin, I have 150 teachers on my roster that I'm supposed to support. And my message to them is, find your teacher trailblazers. Start with them. Don't be so overwhelmed by your numbers that becomes the reason you don't dive in with a handful. So for me, I always start with the early adopters, the teacher trailblazers, the ones I don't have to convince of the value. And we move through the coaching cycle. And usually with them, we move pretty quickly. And so once they've moved through it, then they have these tools they can take into PLC and use. And they also become these classrooms where, as I work with the next group that's maybe not quite as excited, but they're open, we can start going into those classrooms and they can see different models in action. So I get to capitalize on those teachers I've already worked with. So for me, that coaching piece, and then the PLC, which I really argue in the book should be built into teachers' schedules, so they have a time and an expectation of meeting regularly so they can kind of pursue their own action and inquiry cycle together. That's kind of the 3-part progression I would love to see at schools. And I would love to see coaches taking a much more hands-on, deep dive, one-on-one approach with a handful of teachers at a time. So that's kind of what I lay out in the book and I talk about. So yes, I do have to coach the very hesitant teacher, the teacher who's been teaching 32 years, the teacher who doesn't see any value in this, and usually it's a little rocky in the beginning. Where I typically have the most success and the attitudes start to change is in the part of our coaching cycle where we lesson plan together. Because I am very focused on, we have a lesson planning session, you will leave with a lesson. You will not leave with a bunch of ideas that then you have to figure out how to make into a lesson. We're going to build the lesson together. And I think that's the step in the coaching cycle where teachers are like, oh, okay, this lady's helpful. This lady's bringing value to my life. And so instead of pushing back against what she's trying to do, they start to lean in. So it's been really interesting because I've worked with all types of teachers, the really excited, the really reluctant, or the downright, I don't want to do this teacher. It's an interesting dynamic on both ends of the spectrum.
Oh yeah, I've been there. And it's really interesting. And you mentioned this earlier in our conversation about, like, even when you have your early adopters, right, who are so excited and they're doing it, and then they come back to you and they say, I'm giving it to students, I'm giving them ownership, and they don't want to do the work because they're used to me
right
giving it to them. So now, now what do I do?
Yeah. Well, and it's funny because those of us who are really excited in this space, we're like, yeah, student-centered classrooms, giving them agency, like authentic audience. Kids are like, my kids come into my classroom first, 6 weeks of class, and they're like, what lady? Like, what do you expect me to do? Like, my job is to sit here and take some notes and just like stare at you. And I'm like, that's not how it's going to be in here. You're going to drive the learning. And if we're real honest about it, it's much harder to be a student in a student-centered classroom than a student in a teacher-centered classroom. You have to lean in, you have to ask questions, you have to collaborate with your peers, you got to troubleshoot. That's hard. But you know what? It's also developing the skills they're going to need. And in the long run, it's more rewarding. I've had very few kids walk away from my class, I think, and feel like I didn't like that experience. Yeah. Was it hard? Did I not like it? I don't think a lot of them would say that. I think a lot of them would say, Miss Tucker, like, she expects a lot because she thinks we can do it. You know, like eventually they realize I'm pushing them because I know they can do it. They're capable. And the ones who struggle, then I am there at their biggest cheerleader, their biggest support system to make sure they can make as much progress as possible.
Oh yeah, no doubt. And I tell teachers when we start this journey, if you're working harder than your students, then you're doing too much.
Yes, I know. I say the same thing. I'm like, the reason most teachers feel like they don't have the bandwidth for technology and changes in their practice is because they're exhausted. And you know why they're exhausted? Because we do the lion's share of the work in the classroom. And if you're doing the lion's share of the work in the classroom, that means students aren't doing enough work.
So in your book, you have several chapters dedicated to blended learning coaching.
Yes.
So and as you mentioned earlier, you know, a school will have, you know, a math coach, a literacy coach, and, you know, data coach and whatever. How is a blended learning coach different from those other coaches? And how can coaching be implemented in a way that creates a culture, teacher buy-in, as well as teacher effectiveness that promotes growth for not only the teacher, but for the student?
I think there's going to be an evolution of coaching that happens in the next 10 years. I think that we do have all of these little pockets of coaching, and yet now we're introducing all of this technology. And so on some level, even if I was a literacy coach, I'm going to have to start think about how can technology support this process. And so I think there's going to be a little bit of that. But for me, when I think about the blended learning coach, you really have to have it's beneficial if you have the strong educator background with the pedagogy, you have the coaching training, so you know how to interface with people in a way that is productive and respectful and going to be successful, hopefully, because not everybody is going to be a great fit for that. And then a technology enthusiast. I think a blended learning coach, because when I work with teachers, they'll say, I'd love to do this. And I'm like, catalog. What are the tools that I'm aware of that could help you get closer to this objective? So on some level, it's really helpful if the blended learning coach is someone who likes technology, who likes to poke around and explore tools, so that they have kind of a tool belt that they can draw from as they're assisting teachers. So that's when I think about the blended learning coach, it's that instructional coach with the strong pedagogy, the strong coaching skills, and then a real kind of openness to technology. In terms of creating a professional learning culture, I think that has to come from the top. I think that, you know, on some level, leadership has to value professional learning. And it's one thing to say, yes, we're all learning, we're a professional learning community. And then there's kind of like a put the money where your mouth, you know, like, are you willing to invest in it in a tangible way? Because what I see are lots of districts throwing a ton of money at technology, buying the hardware, you know, beefing up the Wi-Fi infrastructure. And then not a lot is changing in teacher practices. You know, there's a lot of teachers using technology to substitute, you know, instead of writing, now we're going to type it up on a document. There's nothing transformative happening as they introduce these devices and this access to the internet. And so for me, in the book, I make the point that schools need to invest equally in building a professional learning infrastructure. So yeah, if you have two coaches on a campus of 1,800 students and maybe 80 teachers, how are you leveraging those coaches? Are those coaches going to be able to support that personnel? What does this learning path look like for this community? Do we honor it with a common prep for teachers so they can meet and have a real PLC? So the vision I lay out is not an easy one. It's not an easy path to walk. It's not a cheap path to walk. But you know what? If you're not willing to invest in it, just stop buying all the hardware, because it's not going to yield the changes you are looking to see in classrooms, period. So it's together that these two investments need to be made if we want to see real change.
Mm-hmm. And in your book, you lay out how coaches should ask questions, and you have specific questions to ask. What I have noticed that a lot of coaches act more like consultants or trainers, where they come in and they say, this is a curriculum program that we have purchased. Teach to this way, use this program with fidelity, versus the questioning, getting teacher input, getting teachers to really think about their own practice, their own strengths, outcomes they want to achieve. How important in the coaching process is questioning?
So your example of how a lot of teachers kind of interface with coaches is I see that a lot. The coach is there to make sure teachers are using the learning management system, that they are, using the online curriculum. And then they're kind of coming into those coaching sessions with an agenda. It's their agenda. This is what I need the teacher to do. And if you approach it from the perspective that I kind of talk about in my book, the questions are so important, because in the same way, it's crucial for students to enjoy agency and be creative in the classroom, to stay engaged and want to be there and to do their best work. Teachers need that too. They need to experience agency. They can't, as soon as you tell teachers, this is how you have to do your job, you need to teach this exact way, man, you've just taken all of that agency, all of that creativity that led so many of us into this profession, you've taken it away. And for me, I'm not there to tell teachers how to do their job. I'm there to support them so that they can figure out, here are my goals, here are my objectives, this is what we're working on. How can I get there? Let's work on that together. So that can't be me coming in with my agenda. The best coaches are the ones who ask good questions and they're good listeners. That's it. Fundamentally, I think if you ask questions and you listen, and then you support that teacher in trying to get closer to that vision that they have for their classroom, that's where you're going to be successful. It's really interesting that you bring that up, because I do see there's a lot of animosity between coaches and teachers, because teachers feel like the coach is coming in to tell them how to do their jobs.
And I also don't see partnerships between people who have my position and people who are district or school level coaches. Because when I come in and I try to tell teachers, listen, my job isn't here to tell you what to do. Part of it is, how does this thing function? But another part of it is, I want you to think about your strengths, think about your students, think about where your students are and where you want to take them. And you come up with your roadmap for getting there. And then we work together on helping you sort of achieve that. And then when you have that district person or a school person who says, this, follow this, I want to see this. When I observe, I want to see this. Principals will be looking at this. And then the technology piece isn't there at all. Then you have teachers saying, well, they're not asking us to use the technology, or they think the technology isn't appropriate here. And my position is trying to work with those people to find out, how can we work more closely together to make sure that teachers are hearing one voice, but not seeing where serving this person is at odds with serving that person.
I see. So kind of being aligned also at the various levels of support.
Yes.
Yeah. No, I would agree. I would agree with that.
So you talk about PLCs,
Mm-hmm.
and it's interesting in how you talk about them in the book, because other people have, you read other people what they've said about PLCs, and then if you actually go into the schools and see what PLCs actually look like, in terms of what you mentioned earlier in your book and gradual release, PLCs is a part of that.
Mm-hmm.
Where does that fall in professional learning, and how does a school ensure that PLCs not only meet the needs, individual needs of the team? Because, the math team will need, in my opinion, have different needs than the ELA team.
Oh yeah, for sure.
As well as the individual teacher, because my teaching style, what I believe in, my strengths, my skills will be different from, even my teacher in my same team. So how does PLCs, or how can you in PLC work to make sure that the individual needs of the team as well as the individual needs of the teacher are actually met?
One of the things that you just said that I think is so, like, it could be the entire reason why we validate a PLC, is really that every person has very individual strengths and interests. And, we might all teach math at this grade level, the 3 or 4 of us or whatever, but we go about it differently. And we have different projects and assignments that have really lit our kids up. But so often we still teach in these silos. And I am so guilty of this as well. I go into my classroom and I do my job. And luckily I've worked in a co-teaching model. So I have at least those 2 people that I interface with regularly. But other people on my campus, no. So I don't know what the English teacher in the next quad is doing that her kids love or that his kids love. And so part of what I feel is so valuable about the PLC model, particularly when we have a shared prep and the expectation is we're going to sit together once a week, whatever the expectation is, on our prep, and we're going to learn with each other. The whole goal is to decide as a group what's something we're interested in. And maybe the thing we pick this month isn't like the top of my list, but it's probably on my list somewhere, right? And then let's figure out as a team of very different strengths and personalities and interests, how we want to tackle this kind of challenge, how we teach this particular skill, how we incorporate this technology in this way, how we rethink the writing assignment for a particular unit, whatever it is that we're tackling. And let's work together as a team to kind of identify a challenge that we want to focus on, brainstorm strategies, implement in our classrooms, bring documentation back, look at that together, and then iterate, fine-tune, and improve. I think the thing about PLCs, because coaching is that one-on-one relationship aimed to really support the individual teacher, but in terms of long-term growth, continual learning, that should be happening in a PLC. That's where teachers are going to be able to really refine their practice and learn from each other. So coaching is so important, but like you said, you have a ton of turnover this year at your school. There's always going to be this turnover. So over time, if you have coaches working with teachers, you have this PLC model, you're going to have the folks in the PLC who've been through the coaching. They can kind of take the lead on certain aspects of PLC, and the coach can be working with those new teachers, supporting them as they contribute in the PLC. So I really see it as like the backbone of professional learning on a campus. It is the time, it is the structure, hopefully, that's put in place to help teachers continue to learn. Once they they know how to use tech. Once they know what the blended models look like, they're still refining and improving together. And, I'm not an expert on PLCs or the whole books you can buy to like dive into that, but I really do think that we should be prioritizing those teacher connections and that collaboration and that continual learning through an inquiry and action cycle.
So I want to start to end this podcast by asking you about a moment or an experience that you went into beforehand and you left with an aha moment that actually went into your book.
Into this one.
Yes.
Okay. So in my role as a coach, and this kind of speaks to something that you've already brought up or that we were just chatting about. I had this moment, and I write about it because I was working with a teacher. She's been teaching 32 years, and so she's been doing this job a long time, and she teaches 5th grade. And we were supposed to have a real-time coaching session where she's implementing, and I can literally pause the lesson. She and I can talk. The students can contribute their ideas. My real-time coaching is a very dynamic, in the moment kind of experience. So that's what I was thinking I was coming in for. The night before, I get this email from her at, I don't know, it's like 4:30 in the afternoon. Hey, Catlin, you know what I think would be more helpful for me is if you led a model math lesson. And I like gasped because one, I am not like I'm not mathematically minded. I'm in the ELA world for sure. Even though I support teachers in all subject areas, but I thought, oh my gosh, math. And my knee jerk response was to say no. And then I thought, you know what, Catlin, you ask this person to take risks every single time you work together. So don't tell her no. Take a risk. Go outside of your comfort zone, because that's what you ask her to do when you're coaching, and create this model math lesson. And so I busted my butt. I'm online doing research. I'm talking to math people I know on Twitter, a girlfriend of mine who's a math trainer, and I'm putting together this 3-station rotation to demonstrate a model math lesson. And as the math lesson, as I come in and I'm leading this math lesson, she just gets to kind of observe, like, what's happening? How did I set it up? How are the kids engaging? How does it feel different from the other kinds of lessons she's done? And at one point she kind of sidled up to me and she goes, it's louder in here than I'm used to. And I said, yeah, they're talking, they're playing, like in one station, they're playing a game. She goes, but they look like they're having a lot of fun. And I was like, yeah, they're having a great time. In fact, when the cue sounded for them to rotate, there were audible like, I'm not done at this station. I want to hang out here. And then she said to me also, but I'm not doing anything. And I said, that's okay. And I think in that moment as a coach, I walked away realizing 2 things. One, as a coach, you have to be willing to take risks. You have to be willing to put yourself out there and move outside your comfort zone, because you're modeling that for teachers and you're asking your teachers to do that. And 2, let your teachers know it is okay that they don't have to do all the work. Like, it's okay to let students drive the learning. And I think a lot of teachers are very uncomfortable with that reality. And so they just need me to hear me say, it's okay. This is great. What's happening in here. So it was a really powerful moment and definitely made it into my book.
Awesome. Love it. So before we go, what is your advice to teachers, coaches, administrators who even though they know everything is changing around them, but they don't want to give up the traditional classroom? When they hear things like blended learning, it's just another buzzword to them, like one-to-one.
Right.
And they really don't see the need to evolve. They don't even see, like, down the line, like, school is changing so much. The technology is changing so much. In 5 years, your school district could even tell you you're going to teach one online class, solely online class.
Mm-hmm.
But they're not seeing that. They're like, this is it. These four walls, this is my show.
Mm-hmm.
And I don't care what's going on around me. You can put 30 iPads in my classroom. I'm still going to teach the same way. So what do you say to those individuals that they just don't see the shift to blended learning as something that they need to pay attention to or even embrace?
Well, I think my advice for leaders, coaches, and teachers would be different. For leadership, I would really encourage them to have a strong vision of what should the student experience be like on this campus. Because I think if leaders sat down and asked themselves that question, the experience they describe would be really different probably from the experience that currently kids are having. And so how you get from, where they actually are to where they want to be is having that vision is so important. I've been in a lot of, in districts where that piece is missing. And so nobody knows where the ship is headed. We just keep doing what we're doing because we don't have a vision for where we should be headed. So for leadership, I think it is so crucial that they have a vision and that they really support teachers by weaving professional learning into the fabric of their school, period. Like leadership, have a vision and figure out how are you getting teachers continually learning, because a single day of training or a handful of days of training is not going to get it done. For teachers or for coaches, I would say so many coaches I work with are so overwhelmed. I think it's so important for them to give themselves permission to scoop up a group of teachers and just start there. Instead of being overwhelmed and thinking, I can't meet all these needs, I have X number of teachers I'm supposed to support, I'll just, create a website and a Twitter handle and I'll share resources and I'll post things online and they can come to that. I think the investment of time with actual humans, that one-on-one, is so valuable. And so start with a small group and then just let it build, because it will build. If you start with teachers and they feel supported and they experience change, what you're doing is going to start to yield some exciting energy on your campus, and you're going to move the needle more than you would if you were kind of overwhelmed and just posting things digitally for teachers. And then in terms of teachers, I think my advice to them is always start small. Start with one thing. I think part of what teachers push back against is this idea that now everything has to change. Everything in my teaching practice has to change. They expect me to do it all overnight. No, this is a journey, and you are the lead learner, or should be, in your classroom. And your classroom should be a space where everybody is learning, everybody's experimenting, everybody is failing, you too. And if we're not treating our classrooms that way, then we're not making the most of this profession. And I don't know that we're really modeling what we're asking of our students. So, really start small, know that it's going to be an incremental process, and then treat your classroom like your own experimental playground, because that's really how things are going to change. That's really where kids, if we start treating it that way, where kids will feel safe actually taking risks themselves, because they see us doing it and they see us learning and experimenting, and they, kids get it and they really value that.
That's all right, people. That's all right. Catlin Tucker.
Thank you for having me.
You are welcome, people. You need to read this book, people. She just talked about leadership, and look, in the book, she talks about branding, teachers going out and not, getting professional development on your own, seeking out as well. This is a great book, people. I'm glad I, got a sneak peek of it, and it answers the questions. But for real, this is a book that you want to buy. There's going to be a link in the post for you to go pick it up. Catlin, thank you for coming on the show.
Yeah, you're so welcome. Thank you for having me.
You are welcome. So people, you know how I do this. The video cast will be going up on YouTube. I need you to follow, subscribe, leave your comments. The podcast itself is going up on iTunes and SoundCloud. I need you to follow, subscribe, leave some stars, rate me high. Your boy's trying to get Oprah on the show. So I'm trying to do it big around here. I want her to know I'm doing big things, people. As always, thank you for watching another episode of the Dr. Will Show. People, invest in you, EDU. Peace.